Hello and welcome to Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the curator of Firestarters and also the founder of consultancy business owned Dead Fish. So Firestarters, if you're not familiar with it, is a series of live events that we have done at Google for about 9 years, actually. So a series of events for the advertising and marketing community primarily. And we ran them as live events, obviously, over the course of those 9 years, but now we've pivoted to virtual, of course, like many things. And so Firestarters has always been about interviewing and hearing from some of the most well-respected people in the industry and the most interesting and interested, I think, is how we like to frame it. So we've got one of those with us today, which is Gareth Kay. So Gareth Kay, the co-founding partner of Chapter in San Francisco. Would you get to introduce yourself?
Hi, Neil. Thank you for having me. It's great to be part of Firestarters. You've run a fantastic program. So yes, I'm Gareth. I am the co-founder of a creative company called Chapter in San Francisco. We work with the likes of Google and Target and Electronic Arts. Before that, I was the chief strategy officer at Goodby Silverstein and Partners, an ad agency in San Francisco. Moved to the States at the turn of the 2000s. And before that, started my career off in planning in London. And bizarrely, Neil and I never crossed paths, despite us both working on IPC. Neil was there, and I was working on the NME and Melody Maker when they were still print magazines. We were unluckily never crossed paths.
Fantastic. Let's go. Yeah, that is remarkable. Actually, we never did, but. So as you probably know by now, Firestarters is really framed or loosely framed around 5 questions. So we always ask our guests what's the best thing you've learned and what's the biggest mistake, and also key insights really about how the industry is changing and what you see for the future, and also what you wish I'd asked you as well. So we're going to loosely frame our conversation around that. So if we can get straight into that first question, Gareth, I'd love to know from you about what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date that you'd like to share with everyone.
Sure. I think there's a few things that are somewhat interrelated. They may not seem so on the surface, but I think there are some kind of interrelations to it. I think the first thing I learned, and this is probably a lesson I learned stupidly quite late in my career, is one that really rang true to me when I was working at Goodby Silverstein, was just the power of really strong, diverse teams with a high density of talent. And I began to realize that when I looked at the creative companies, I think generally businesses, frankly, that I think outperform their competition, that really kind of become quite kind of iconic in the world. I think the kind of commonality they tend to have is just the density of talent they are able to attract and maintain, and frankly, create the environment that lets them perform at their absolute best. And it was just an obvious thing to realize, but just that sense of just wherever you looked, being able to see people who could make any stupid thought you had better, and hopefully you could make any great thought they had 1% better, made absolutely all the difference. So I think teams to me became a really important kind of notion of kind of the operating unit of success, and one that I think, you see now more often than not being taught about in the business press, but at the time I think was certainly a new, if not obvious, learning for me. I think linked into that bizarrely is actually inside those teams the importance of the individuals inside those teams, and making sure that you build teams that are genuinely diverse, both obviously in terms of their demographic makeup, but I think also as well in terms of their experience, biases, skills, so that you can really build something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And I also think that's a really important thing for when you are traveling through your career, because one of the kind of great lessons I got early on, some of the great advice I got early on in my time working in advertising, was to stop obsessing about what agency you worked at and what brands you were working on, and instead really be focused on the individuals you will be working with and what you would be learning from them. And that advice really helped me build, I think, a much better start and a much better foundation to my career than I would have had otherwise. So I started off working with Chris Baker, who was an amazing planner, but was really a quantitative researcher by trade. So he taught me all the things you needed to learn around, quant research and actually measuring advertising effectiveness, which is really, really powerful. Then worked for Simon Clemo, who is in many ways kind of the opposite, where his strengths is all really around the kind of primacy of the big kind of creative idea at the heart of brands, and just great at really thinking imaginatively about what the problem businesses were facing, and what brands could be to help solve that problem.
Okay.
And then worked for Gary Duckworth, who was just a brilliant, I think, just empathetic individual, and really got to the nub of what made people tick, and was fantastic at teaching you how to be empathetic, not just with, I guess, people in the real world, but with the folks you worked with day in, day out. And picking up those sets of skills made me who I am today, for better or for worse. And I think it's very much like Jeremy Bullmore talks about how brands are built, which are kind of like, how a bird builds a nest from the scraps and straws you chance upon. I think your planning style and the way you think about working inside a business comes from that kind of collision of individuals, where you pick what you like and throw away what you don't. And I think importantly, it's not just about the planners you work with, it's about the really good kind of account people and agency management folks you can learn from, and about the really good creative people you work with. I mean, I was lucky enough, to be able to work with people like Lance Jensen at Modernista when I moved to the US, with folks like Trevor Beatty, with Nigel Roberts, and Paul Belford, all of whom just could have been strategists themselves,
Right.
but also had amazing craft skills. And they taught me all so much from a different perspective about how to think about planning, and also, I guess, how planning serves a product at the end of it, rather than it being, a thing in and of itself, which sounds, again, incredibly obvious, but I think is often forgotten about. So those two things, I think, are two of the big learnings, and they forge for me, Neil. The third thing I think I picked up on, which, as you said in your beginning, and I just have to repeat it, is the importance of being interested and being interesting. And I can't overstate how important that is to succeed as a strategist, no matter what you're in, whether you're inside an agency, whether you're inside a client business. At the end of the day, you create value through your curiosity, and that value gets realized by your ability to influence people inside the organization, and essentially, help build the relationships and help build the ability to get, I suppose, more capital, whether it's time or money, than others can get to make those things come to life. So I'm just a big believer in, trying to be in places where people are. That's really tough at the moment, but I guess you have to go and do a bit of, varied internet participation. But in real life, I used to love being in coffee shops and bars, and on the bus, or on the BARTers we have in San Francisco, and just see, what people were doing and how they were talking. It's about consuming a varied degree of entertainment and trying to watch what most people watch, rather than what the advertising industry tends to watch, or the marketing industry, and about trying to read diversely as well. It's actually a newsletter I saw this week, and they kind of had an interesting research piece, I think based in the UK, that just talked about how little people are reading, but more importantly, of those folks who are reading, how small their selection of books actually is, and they're not really opening themselves up to the breadth of things that are out there. And of course, the obvious thing you always point to, I guess, in our world, is people just reading books about marketing and books about business, all of which is useful. But I think if you want to have competitive advantage, you need to have different sources to help inspire different thoughts in your mind.
That's really interesting, because I think there was a piece that I read a couple of years ago of yours, where you were talking a bit about how planners were maybe specializing themselves into irrelevance, I think is the way you put it.
Yeah.
And that sort of, so I mean, I guess that really relates to that kind of point you were making there about diversity. I mean, do you think really that actually, with the way the industry has evolved and expanded in many ways, that actually that kind of need for specialism is kind of hampering good planning?
I think it can do quite easily. I do look back to the kind of, I guess, the industry, I'm just going to show my age now, the industry I grew up in, the industry that exists now, and, down to, I think, the big move of the holding companies to have more and more specialist agencies for them to go and drive their bottom line and to go and solidify their businesses, I think has hurt planners, because you end up being, if you're not careful, very focused on the channel that you are operating in. So you think about, what is the advertising solution? what is the DM solution, what is the digital solution to a problem, rather than thinking about what is the real problem a business faces, what's the human problem behind that, identifying and finding that problem, and then solving it by whatever means are necessary. And I think, you go back to the original foundation of planning and look at some of the original practitioners, the Stephen Kings of the world. They did things like not just make ad campaigns, they did things like invent Mr. Kipling cakes for rank Hovis McDougall to help them sell more flour at a premium price. And it wasn't a advertising solution. The problem that was there that needs to be solved had to be solved by actually a creative business solution, not just a piece of comms.
And so does that mean, do you think that ad agencies need to reframe themselves and rethink what they actually, the industry that they're in almost, or what's the change?
I think it's get back to their roots a little bit. I think when they were, really, really awesome as, frankly, outsourced marketing functions for our clients, but we're really good at bringing that external perspective. I think the big two mistakes agencies have made looking back on my time have been a couple of things. One has been the over focus on specialization. You still need to have specialized skills, but the ability to apply those to a broader palette is really, really important. And that opportunity, I would argue, is greater than ever before. But secondly, it was about trying to mimic and copy clients as opposed to actually deliberately being different. I remember hearing a story, think I can talk about this, I think it's public, but it's a story that Dylan Williams told me years ago about when BBH pitched for their first piece of Unilever business, which was Lynx, the deodorant brand, or Axe, it's called around the rest of the world. And as they did it, they won the business, and a memo in those days, it wasn't all agency emails, a memo I think went around BBH that said, "We're going to Unilever. For God's sake, make sure you're not looking scruffy. At the very least, wear a shirt tucked into trousers, not jeans." And there was a memo going around Unilever going, "BB8 have agreed to work with us. Whatever you do, please don't look like your normal stuffy selves. Wear jeans, look cool, look young." And I wasn't quite said like that, but the point being was they were trying to ape and copy one another. But I think the best relationships that have formed over time have been when there is difference and you're bringing actually something additive to the picture. There's probably a bit of friction that goes on as a result of that, but I think that's what actually creates the value in the first place. I think those two things are just mistakes agencies have made, perhaps very broadly in their relationship with clients. Not every agency makes that, but I think those are two of the kind of root problems they need to address as an industry.
Okay. So you talked there about mistakes the industry or agencies made. What about mistakes that you've made in your career?
Oh my God. You asked about this beforehand, and I sat there and wrote this very long list because I've made a lot of mistakes in my time. I guess on reflection, the ones I would point to would probably suggest that I've completely ignored all my learnings, but I guess you learn from your mistakes, as they say. I think if I look back on my time in the industry, the thing I regret perhaps the most personally is, yes, I got to work with some different people, but I worked with some remarkably similar types of agencies. I worked in advertising agencies, my whole first 20 years or whatever of my career. And I kind of look back and go, I wish I'd done something like the WPP fellowship, where you get pushed into different types of creative companies inside their portfolio early on, because what a wonderful learning experience that can be, where you see how you can approach the same problem quite often, but from very different perspectives and through very different lenses. So I wish I'd perhaps been a bit more expansive in the types of companies I've worked with, and a little bit braver about making a jump to adjacent types of creative companies. I look back and I had a chance to work at Naked when they were very, very young. And that would have been amazing because John, the two Johns, God bless John Hollow, and John Wilkins, who's an amazing friend and mentor to me still now, and Will Collin have built something that was genuinely different and special. I look at places like Glue and some of the early digital agencies in London. I wish I'd had the bravery, frankly, to go and make the jump there. That was a mistake, I think. I think I learned a lot from the different types of people and the different ways they thought about problems. I think linked to that as well, I mean, yes, I've done more than perhaps a lot of people in the industry, and I've worked in more than one location, but I've worked in the UK and I've worked in the US, which are maybe the most similar places you could possibly choose to work geographically. I mean, they're separated by just very different forms of spelling, you know, the overuse of Z's and the lack of use in the US. But I wish I'd done some things like perhaps, you know, Rob Campbell had done, where he went out to China. And I think that would have opened my eyes to a whole different perspective around culture and the world, and have such a Western view of how things are done. That worries me, because I think increasingly we're actually seeing culture is being driven now, not by the US and the UK and Europe, but by Asia, by what's going on in, you know, South Korea and Taiwan and China and Japan. I wish I'd learned that. I wish I'd learned the languages there. I wish I'd learned the culture there, because I think that is really important nowadays, to understand how those markets work. And I just don't. I can look at them from afar, but unless you're actually there, living there and feeling them, I don't think can really understand, you know, how they tick. And then I think the third thing maybe I'd look at probably goes down to my relationship style and of working with people. And I strongly believe in the power of teams, but I have made the mistake far too often of being maybe not available enough for others. I certainly look back to my time running the strategy group at Goodby, and my biggest regret there, you know, I think we did some great stuff as a group there, but I tended to try and solve the problem myself far too often, particularly when I got to kind of new business pitches, because there was pressure to get it done now and to get it done quickly. And you were talking to the management team who were working on it. So those were the conversations were happening. I don't think I spent enough time lifting the others up. I don't think I spent enough time bringing the diverse mix of folks who were hiring at Goodby into those problems to help us get to better solutions. I think almost like a little bit of kind of, I guess, the short term damaging the long term. So we got to something quickly in the short term, which let you move forward in a pitch or to solve a problem you're having with the client. But I think long term, I wasn't helping expose some of the younger talent we're bringing into the company to those types of situations early enough. And I don't think we extracted the full value of the team we were building quite deliberately at Goodby, which was a very diverse group of strategists. And I look back, and that's probably the thing I look back on and go, what was I doing? And I can understand perhaps why I made the mistake. I just wish I hadn't kept making it for far too long. And it took me some time for others to point it out to me and go, yeah, you're absolutely right.
It's really interesting. You're talking a lot about diversity there, and diversity of thinking and experience. I mean, in the first Firestarter video we did with Richard Huntington, we talked again, similar kind of regret about not sort of actually thinking more expansively about where he could work, different markets and so on. But it does strike me that the industry is pretty bad at actually valuing diversity in thinking and experience.
Yeah.
And you know, they really kind of look for kind of cookie cutter solutions in people, and you know, they're actually very bad at doing that. So do you think there's a what needs to change in order to kind of get better at that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it's anything that's kind of an intellectual bias or kind of almost maybe an active bias against it. I think it's kind of becomes a muscle memory. I remember when I was at Goodby trying to bring in folks from, you know, other types of creative companies. So, you know, I got told off by IDEO for trying to raid and, you know, pick up a bunch of their strategists from there. And I brought them into Goodby, and they were brilliant because they just thought about things really differently, and they were really demanding about working collaboratively with people. But that was such a shock to the system that it took a long time for them to bed in. I think it took a long time for them to be comfortable. And I'm not sure if they ever were able to really be who they truly were inside that type of ecosystem. So I think a lot of it is about making more adaptive and flexible and open-minded working environments. I think it's less about the people. I think it's more about the working environment that we create. And then I think there is genuinely, Neil, a need for the industry to do some of its own medicine and actually market more to folks about what they can get from a career in advertising. I just don't think it's seen as being as desirable nowadays. I mean, you hear that a lot about trying to recruit at kind of, you know, entry level from university. And there's all kinds of issues around, you know, the pay's terrible, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a bigger kind of elephant in the room, which is just the industry is not seen as exciting and as appealing and as vital an engine of culture as perhaps it was 20, 30 years ago. And I think we need to do a better job at trying to explain to talent, this is what you can do. Because a way to change the acceptance, I think, of the talent is to have more of it inside the industry. And I think it's maybe more of a challenge getting them in than it is about actually how they work inside the system itself. That's my gut anyway on it.
Yeah, and it's just striking me what you were saying earlier about the ability of the industry to kind of, if you frame it in the context of solving business challenges, but doing it creatively. I mean, wow, what an opportunity that is! It's just such an amazing kind of what a thing to have as a job,
Yeah, and the talent is still there. The talent's amazing, and I think it was genuinely, the quality of some of the people in the industry is just jaw-droppingly good. And you just watch what people go off to do sometimes in their lives after working in an agency, and there's probably a very good series of like podcasting of people to talk about what advertising created for them or planning or whatever it might be to help launch their very successful next stage of their career, very different next stage of their career. But I think there is just a huge opportunity. It's an amazing industry to be able to go and do that. I still think agencies and advertising agencies are still very well placed to have that type of influence on a client business. I just think it's about reasserting ourselves. And I think it's maybe taking back some of the ground that has been ceded over time, either for vanity reasons or for financial reasons inside organizations. And frankly, as well, I think building relationships inside client organizations beyond the CMO. I think, agencies used to be kind of at the CEO level and be at board meetings. They stopped doing that. But I think it's less about, what level you're operating at. It's more about how much influence you can have across a business. And, are you friends with the chief revenue officer? Are you able to influence the chief product officer? Are you able to influence, the customer retention folks? I mean, there's just a whole world outside the normal purview of the kind of CMO. But I think nowadays you have to have the relationship with to go and be able to really influence a business in the way the industry is able to and needs to.
Yeah. And I mean, the next question, which is really about how the industry is changing and going to be exciting. I'm curious also to just ask you about your experience of the work you're doing now, which does feel sort of like it's evolving and evolved. So, I mean, what's your perspective on bringing in that kind of different way of working and how the industry is changing, and your insight into what's really happening with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's challenging. I think it's kind of an interesting kind of couple of tensions going on because of the moment of time we're in. So we have difficulty in being so diverse in the type of work we do and deliberately saying to clients, we just want to find a problem and solve it in whatever shape it takes. They go, that sounds great, but where do I put you in my line item on my Excel spreadsheet? What budget are you coming out of? So that's one problem, is actually going, so where do I fit you into my old model of the world? So that becomes quite challenging. And the second piece that I think we've learned, which is the actual unlock we found, is to move away from perhaps being so focused on CMOs as our clients and our entryway into organizations, and shifting much more now into product folk as being our entryway into organizations. And certainly I look back at the projects that I think have had the greatest impact on, and the projects that I frankly, selfishly enjoyed the most, and I think the companies enjoyed the most. And they've been the ones when we have gone not in through the marketing door, we've gone in through the product door or through maybe their business consultancy units inside agencies, and gone through there and had an ability, a much more expansive ability to spread through an organization and to build the relationships and influence to genuinely build, an end-to-end experience. We found that when we go through the CMO door, and this is maybe partly true of the Valley as well, it's much more difficult to go and build that type of relationship and influence to really go and drive some of the more core parts of how the brand is delivered nowadays. And that has been an interesting learning for us. It's definitely been a challenge, but I feel it's been the one that's helped us unlock the door a little bit, is just going through a different entryway into the business.
That's really interesting, because I mean, it strikes me that with different functions, it's like when functions get to work together, you've got a much more holistic view of the impact you can make,
Yes.
the changes you can do, the kind of bringing product into it. It feels like there's a real blurry line at the moment between what is product and what is marketing, and marketing getting baked into product, and product ways of thinking coming into marketing. Do you think that's a healthy thing, or is that actually creating challenges, problems?
I think it's really healthy in terms of, the end of the day, people in the real world don't see what division you're in. They see a thing. They see a brand. They have an experience with it. It's made up of loads and loads of different interactions over time. So I think the more you can have an organization that mimics that, the better. But I think that the trick is to actually design the organization for that reality. So I get very interested by companies like Airbnb, for example, who, yes, they have some functional disciplines there, but they tend to organize their business around the different stakeholders of their business. So, around the hosts, around the guests, around investors even, and they design deliberately the organization to be able to work in a cross-functional way to deliver against those stakeholders. Where it gets messy, I think, sometimes is when you have perhaps one part of the organization trying to bring others to help them solve their problem. And that gets challenging when you're in a world, for example, of OKRs, the kind of classic John Doerr book, and the classic Google way of managing your business. And I understand the need for that kind of very clear, you are responsible for delivering this year. Makes lots and lots of sense inside a very large organization. I think the danger of it, and it's one that hasn't really been addressed very well, is you end up not being incentivized to work well with others and to help others.
Okay.
So you are basically going, well, look, I know that's really important, but I've got to go and deliver this year. So I'm just going to focus all my time and all my money and all my people on delivering against that. Sorry. Without realizing that actually, when you all work together, it's the old, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I just think that's a major problem, is actually the design of organizations nowadays. And I think that's one of the, I'm not sure what you're finding, Neil, but that's one of the big challenges about how they're incentivized as individuals and how they're designed as an organization.
Yeah, completely. And dependencies, so if
Yes.
you to sort of create a good experience, you're dependent on 6 teams who do different things, and actually that can slow you down. They're kind of like, they are working to different agendas. It's just that whole dependencies piece is really quite challenging, I think.
Oh, it's quite. I had a conversation the other day with a potential client, and they were talking about wanting a new brand. They want a positioning, a value proposition, and new visual and verbal language to describe it. And it's really important because we've got a new product rolling out next year. The whole product's been redesigned. It's like, so that's a separate work stream to the brand thing. And he's going, this is crazy, but these two things aren't coming together because they should absolutely feed off, inform, and be influenced by one another. And it should be one meta work stream that you then chunk down. But still, even inside, some of the more modern organizations, you see these very siloed ways of working where brand is a surface layer put on top of the product, rather than being the operating code that informs everything a company does.
That's a really interesting way of putting it, an operating code. I mean, I think part of the kind of product coming into marketing is, of course, you're launching something, and a big part of the brand is the product experience. Creating these artificial lines between customer acquisition and product usage and things like that is actually doesn't really make sense at all, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think it comes down to one of the most fundamental issues I keep seeing in terms of kind of, I guess, language, is using kind of marketing and advertising and comms as interchangeable words. And when you're kind of defining marketing as being part of that set, to your point, you are immediately cutting off the product piece, which absolutely lies at the heart and was always the absolute critical foundation for how you kind of felt about a brand. And that is even more the case now than it ever was before. And the marketing industry, not the advertising, the marketing industry, I think, has done itself a disservice by allowing itself to be positioned into a place of communications and advertising, as opposed to actually thinking about how do they create irresistible, sustainable demand for their good or service.
Right. Okay, so taking that sort of thought about the industry, be that advertising, marketing, but I mean, in terms of a prediction of where you think it's going to go, or your kind of thoughts about what the future holds for the industry?
I'm very concerned about marketing. I think there is, still remarkable perceptions that it's a cost base inside the organization rather than an investment that unlocks amazing value over time.
Okay.
I think there's huge need to go and prove the effectiveness and efficiency of marketing, to move from kind of a mindset of what marketing is and what things marketing makes into why we are doing things, and showing the kind of commercial link between activity and the bottom line. That's about trying to obviously, get CFOs fully on board with what we're doing. But I think also as well to make marketing feel more vital to a business. So I think there's a big kind of marketing piece around proving the kind of commercial effectiveness of it. I think there's a need for marketing to, in many ways, refine what it's always been about, which is around creating a sense of demand amongst people, and using whatever tools are required to go and deliver against that. And quite often that will be the product or the product experience. So I do worry, particularly, where we are in San Francisco, you see brand marketing and product marketing. You do sit there sometimes and scratch your head and go, why are there these two things? Marketing is marketing. And I understand the difference, but at the same time, I do scratch my head still at that sometimes. And I think it's about marketing to stopping ceding its ground to becoming essentially chief communications officer or chief advertising officer. It's about getting back into the nitty gritty of what is the experience we need to deliver to people that is going to be compelling, that's going to be sustainable, and that's going to be impossible for others to copy. And I think that's where the real value comes from. And I think maybe there's been far too much time of marketing being seen as being kind of a creative nicety that you slap onto the business at the end of the day, as opposed to being a much more vital cog in a machine that delivers real commercial return for people. So I think those are important. I think the other thing I would just say is I think it's really important that marketing looks outwards again as well and thinks about how can we do things that leave the world in a better place from what we do, rather than in the same place, or sadly more often the case, a worse place. And I think, almost being, responsible for the ethics of the organization, being responsible for having empathy around the impact that you have on people and society becomes really, really important. I think, there's some brands like Unilever, I think, are genuinely doing pretty amazing things at scale to try and begin to address that. Yeah. But I don't think it's being done in enough places and being seen as being of equal importance as the kind of commercial impact that marketing has.
Okay. And I'm just going to take that into kind of strategy now, because I think one of the things that I remember reading that you'd written a while back, but it was about how strategic thinking was in danger of getting more flabbier and fluffier. I think the words that you actually used. And so do you think in marketing and advertising that we need more specific, focused, strategic thinking now in order to raise the kind of profile of the industry, or do better, or to do better work?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yes, I think that is true. I think we often forget the things we always promote to our clients around, simplification and distillation, and being able to take lots of complexity and turning it into something that's very simple and compelling and hooky and understandable. I think we should go and do much more of that, both for our clients day in, day out, but also for the discipline in and of itself. So I think simplifying how we talk about what we do, as opposed to writing sometimes, and I've been guilty of this, very, florid blog posts and floral think pieces, actually really being good at kind of getting to the point and thinking in bullets and headlines, not just essays. I think it's really, really critical. So I think that's an important thing for us to move from. I think there's some fundamental stuff as well that's going to help maybe allow that to happen. I think there's a real need for planners to get obsessed about finding the real problem to solve, not just solving problems. I think we are still way too obsessed about what the solution is, or what the solution could be. Even look at things like the creative brief, still the big box on that's about what the solution could be, as opposed to what's the real problem we need to solve. And I think if we actually took a bit of the kind of inverted time and inverted attention between the solution and the problem, we'd be in a much better place, because we'd find better problems to solve, and the solutions will flow as a natural result from that. I think that's really important. I think there's a need for us to really help the industry and to help our clients think in the long term and have a longer horizons of thinking, as opposed to shorter term thinking. Yes, there is the pressure of quarterly reporting that a lot of us face with the clients we work on, but I think we have to help advocate for the absolute reality. You look at most of the data around this is that the best solution for a business longer term is to think with a long-term mindset, not to think in a period of quarters that accrete over time. And that is a shift that needs to happen in business, but it's a shift I think that has to happen inside the businesses we work in and the businesses we work for. And then I think the other thing that's really important, you talked about this earlier, Neil, is just the importance of trying to break down those lines between product and communication. And I think far too often as strategists, we tend to think in communication. We may not want to think we do, but the reality is we do. I think the more we can think about how we can bake marketing directly into the product, the more powerful it will become. That means it becomes a lot less about, I guess, verbal potency and about the kind of language we can create for brands. It becomes much more about our softer stuff around how an experience feels, but then understanding how that links back to the business. Because I think there's all the stuff we can go and talk to our clients about, this is just cool. It feels right. All our experience says this is the right thing to do. It feels so right for you. If you can't go, and this is why it is right for you, it's just not going to have the impact it needs to have. It probably won't get bought, and if it does get bought, it won't have the investment behind it needs. So I think that's really, really critical thing about how you can bake marketing into that product experience and that overall, consumer experience.
Brilliant. So I think we've come to our last question actually, which is, what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you? So let me ask you that.
I think the question I would love to get an answer to, and I don't think I've got the answer, but I think it's one we need to answer, is why hasn't planning changed in the last 50 years? I mean, I look back to really the skills that we all are still taught, and they're important skills, and the way we behave. If, Stephen King was dropped into an agency today, I don't think he would see much difference. In fact, I remember Mark Earls telling me a story. I think it was at the 30th anniversary of planning events, so 2 decades ago, Stephen King being there going, hasn't anyone thought of a better idea yet? And it's just remarkable, how little new thinking there has been. So I think, I'm a big believer. I got very obsessed once by an essay by Ben Horowitz, one of the big Silicon Valley investors, and he talked about the etymological meaning of the word technology, which apparently is about a better way of doing things. I think we need some kind of technology applied to planning and strategy, which is to go and find a better way. It's not about jettisoning the past, because we've learned a lot of really good things.
Yeah.
But how can we apply some of those to the context of now and actually think about what planning needs to be to help serve businesses and to help serve brands today and tomorrow? I don't know what the answer is to that. I think there's some things we could look at, like maybe having less of the same voices like myself pop up on blog posts and in interviews, and actually raise up some of the younger talent inside the industry who are perhaps less poisoned, maybe one way of putting it, but certainly less programmed by the process that they go through over time. I think trying to maybe break some of the consensus in the industry as well. And it's remarkable how little disagreement there is between plans about how things work. You look at other, industries, whether it's arts, frankly, or whether it's science, and the amount of disagreement that happens around hypotheses and around ways of approaching problems. You don't get that much of that inside marketing and inside planning. I think a little bit of healthy disagreement and a little bit of, adversarial behavior might not be a bad thing, because maybe that'll help us think a little bit differently about a different path forward.
I think you said once that planners should really be the change agents in agencies, more than anybody else. So do you think they've, what do you think, they failed at that, or do you think that is still a role that planners can play?
I think planners still are change agents. I think they can be and are. And I look at some stuff that's going on in the industry now. There's definitely change that, it's being driven by planning. But I think the way for planning to genuinely change industry is for planning to change itself. I think maybe it was a need, not for navel gazing, but I think it was a way to think about how can we find a more effective way to help brands build, positive, strong relationships with people out there in the real world. And maybe just start trying to find some new ways and some better ways of doing that and experiment a bit more. Have that, great scientist mindset of, let's get to a hypothesis and then let's see if that's true or not. And I think a bit more experimentation in what we do day in, day out, the way we work, who we work with, how we work, could be really, really powerful.
Fantastic. Gareth, that's been amazing, and some really excellent and insightful answers there. So thank you for being part of Firestarters. Really glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Yeah, and just super insightful. So everybody, thank you for listening as well, and do look out for the next video. But my thanks again to Gareth for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, everyone.